Today's event is brought to you by the Price Lab for Digital Humanities and the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. My name is Stuart Varner, and I'm the Managing Director of the Price Lab.
And I'm Meg Ehrenberg. I'm the Managing Director of the Penn Program in Environmental Humanities. We thought we'd start by thanking several people who are in the room and a few who aren't. First and foremost, we want to thank Margie Guy and Sarah Malinsky for, from the Price Lab and the Wolf Humanities Center for all of their help in putting this event together today. I also want to give thanks to my predecessor in this role, Paul Farber, who worked with Stuart in the very early planning stages of this event last spring. And we'd like to express our gratitude for the behind-the-scenes work of our AV folks and the caterers. We have several housekeeping staff who are all contributing to making today possible.
And I want to acknowledge that we're on the traditional lands of the Lenape people. And I also want to acknowledge that we're very close to a part of town commonly known as Black Bottom, a predominantly African-American part of the city which has been challenged repeatedly as Penn and Drexel expand their spheres of influence.
I think recognizing those ongoing histories of occupation and displacement that precede our presence in this room seems particularly important as we begin an event which aims to open a conversation around questions of place and space. Maps loaded with data are ubiquitous in our daily lives. Some of you probably use digital navigation systems to find your way here today. And these tools and the maps and data upon which they are built are often presented to us as certain and authoritative, and they're also often presented as neutral. The building is where it is, the numbers are what they are.
Data and digital maps are ubiquitous in digital humanities and in the environmental humanities as well. But I hope that part of what we do as humanists is to encourage critical reflection on the networks of power from which they emerge. Why is that particular building there, and what used to be there? What questions were asked and what questions were not asked that led to those particular numbers? We might also use our humanistic skills to think creatively with our digital tools that usually seem so sterile. Can we draw speculative maps that locate what could be and that can help us find that? Could data be alive and living outside of a spreadsheet? And as one panel today will ask, can a river actually be an archive, not just of fish and of pollution, but also of stories? We're extremely excited about today's program, which I believe will help us get at each of those questions and probably a few more. We'll start off with a keynote from Shannon Mattern, and then immediately transition into a panel on speculative geography. After that, we'll break for lunch, and when we come back, we'll have a panel on data equity and access. We'll finish up the day with a hands-on workshop over in Van Pelt Library. And I want to pass the mic to Lori Allen, Director of Digital Scholarship at Penn Libraries.
We heard about map rooms from an article that Shannon wrote about the St. Louis map room. We were inspired and interested, and we decided we would try a map room as a method. So the map room, it's really more of a map table. It's like not that big at all, just so that you don't walk in and feel sad. But I think it's going to be a really rich and interesting set of conversations to end a Friday afternoon. We have three sort of versions of the map room, and we'll invite everyone here and basically anyone else to come through. We'll sort of do the same thing 3 times, so 40 minutes, 40 minutes, 40 minutes. So there's a little flexibility about when you're there. But the idea is for us to experiment with this kind of physical and digital map, data as people's writing and also data that is projected. And so we have a lot of data. We have a lot of magic markers, and we have, and I'm really hopeful that we can think together about this tool, the method of map rooms. So there's a lot of space there for that conversation. And so just to give you a sense of what's coming this afternoon, it's really sort of what does the map room do as a method for exploring spaces? And as I said, think map table. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jim English, who's going to get us started today.
I'm the faculty director of the Price Lab. So I'm working as the counterpart to Bethany Wiggin, who is the faculty director in PPEH, to sponsor this event. I want to thank everybody who's already been up here and who've really done the heavy lifting to put this event together. I'm actually on sabbatical this year, and it takes a lot just to get me to cross the South Street Bridge. But for Shannon Mattern at this event, I would have crossed several bridges. So I'm going to introduce Shannon. It's actually not a very easy task. I hope Shannon won't take offense if I say she's sort of impossible to introduce. All of the points of orientation and taxonomy that one tends to use to situate an academic in shorthand for purposes of an intro have been kind of confounded by Shannon in the course of her career. She's someone who's highly interdisciplinary, highly multimodal in her approach, and her work. It speaks importantly and directly to media archaeology, of course, media studies, but to architecture and art history, urban studies, urban planning and policy, book history and the history of libraries. I mean, it's really important work to scholars who specialize, as she does, in many different fields. And this is without even mentioning DH and environmental humanities, which are the two kind of disciplinary or interdisciplinary formations that have brought her here today. She's an award-winning teacher whose teaching extends beyond the New School, where she's a professor of media studies, and involves large public constituencies who are engaged through her work in public humanities, her exhibitions, and other public-facing projects. She seems also to me a community, not only community educator, but a community student, a student of and in the communities that are around her and where she works. The fruits of her research take many forms. You can explore them if you haven't already in her website, Words in Space, where I was looking at this current exhibition project at the new Central Library in Helsinki that she's putting together now. So the range is international as well. She's a prolific writer across many venues, several distinct readerships. Since taking her degree in communication at NYU, she has published something like 75 articles, essays, book chapters, and various sort of long-form journalistic pieces and columns. She's published 3 books. The traditional scholarly monograph is there among her multimodal outputs. They've all been published by Minnesota. They are The New Downtown Library, Designing with Communities in 2007, Deep Mapping the Media City, 2015, and then just last year, Code and Clay, Data and Dirt, 5,000 Years of Urban Media. In these most recent 2 books, and in a series of more than a dozen of her long columns in the journal Places, she's showing that our contemporary smart cities are not as smart as their planners and promoters like to think, and that if our task is to collect and interpret urban data intelligently, we still have a lot to learn from the material history of much earlier cities, whose mediation was rich and complex, but involved no digital computers. What I love about Shannon's work is the way it balances a super astute sense of the present with a deep respect for history, and a lively style and awesome sense of humor with serious commitment to social change, democratization of access, empowerment of marginalized populations. For all the grim political, economic, and ecological circumstances that we are facing, Shannon maintains in her writing equanimity and even optimism. She's an inspiration, and it's my great pleasure to join with you in welcoming her back to Penn today.
Okay. So my talk is called Local Codes, Forms of Spatial Knowledge. I guess before I start, I should thank Stuart and all the other organizers of the event. Thanks so much for having me here. So last year ended with the Equifax scandal, and this year began with Cambridge Analytica. Since then, we've learned, as many have long suspected, that criminal risk assessment and online search algorithms are racist, and that our phones are always tracking our locations. We've learned that for years, Palantir has been secretly testing its predictive policing platform in New Orleans, and IBM has been using NYPD surveillance footage to develop object and facial recognition software. We've discovered that Google and Amazon and Microsoft have been, and in some cases still are, developing technologies for policing, military operations, and immigration control. Technologies likely rife with bias, applied towards the perpetuation of mass incarceration and surveillance, precision warfare, and the separation and detention of immigrants. Some have recognized a need for intervention, an intermediary step between the transformation of hoovered-up data into actionable intelligence. Tech companies have been testifying before Congress, pledging greater oversight and more stringent enforcement of conduct codes. As the Justice Department threatens regulation, some of the same platforms engaged in surveillance and profiling and aggressive target marketing are acknowledging that their imposed socio-political and epistemological roles, as well as their responsibilities that come along with them. CEO Jack Dorsey admits that Twitter has become a public square, and it's thus the company's responsibility to, quote, increase the health of public conversation, end quote. It's not doing a great job, as you might have noticed. In organizing the world's knowledge and hosting diplomatic dialogue between world leaders, these forums, while global in scope, have perhaps recognized with some reluctance that they have obligations to safeguard democratic processes and privacy, particularly among their domestic users. You might have heard there's another data breach this morning, Starwood Hotels. Every day it seems to be there's a new one. Many local data creators and stewards, like municipalities and city libraries, have long recognized such obligations, perhaps in part because the individuals and organizations to whom they're accountable and the potential consequences for mismanagement are more immediate and visceral. Plus, local data systems are frequently working with open data and aren't always motivated, that is, by the same drives for profit and world domination. Yet we know that in recent years, companies like Palantir, IBM, and Google have sold their wares to municipal governments seeking greater efficiency and accuracy, and to local officials lured by the promise of access to vast troves of networked data. Those contracts can lead to platform lock-in and the black boxing of local data, not to mention the erosion of local trust. Perhaps we need to reassess and reassert the local codes of civic data stewardship, which would ideally emphasize transparent partnerships, responsible intermediaries, and checks and balances calibrated to honor core civic values. We might look to see how different communities have joined forces with public institutions to generate, steward, circulate, and activate civic data and other forms of local knowledge. We might ask how these collaborations help not only to generate protocols from the critical, responsible use of local data, but also to help shape the design, maintenance, and administration of the spaces they represent, and the values these spatial practices embody. As Yanni Loukis proposes in his forthcoming book, All Data Are Local, quote, the diversity and prosperity of the world's varied and contingent digital practices depends on our acceptance of data's locality, end quote. So in what follows, we'll address these issues through 4 case studies, each revealing a system of civic data that helps local populations better understand, adopt to, steer, and in some cases, maybe even resist urban and ecological change. These systems exemplify the responsible scaffolding of data into actionable information and public knowledge. Knowledge management experts and informaticians often speak of an epistemological hierarchy. Data, supposedly, when contextualized, becomes information, which itself, when further organized, becomes knowledge, which itself, when fully actualized through lived experience, becomes wisdom. The model is not without its critics, but it does at least helpfully foreground the importance of contextualizing or scaffolding and the means by which those intellectual transformations happen. The four following cases model different methods for building critical epistemological scaffoldings, with which local populations can perhaps orient themselves within and direct the development of their rapidly transforming local terrains. So we first visit Pittsburgh, once a pollution-plagued and industrial powerhouse that's now a hotbed of robotics, automated vehicles, and healthcare. Here, the Civic Switchboard project connects libraries and community information networks into civic data ecosystems. We then travel to Jakarta, a low-lying megacity increasingly prone to climate disasters, where government and citizen-generated data combine to power Peta Bencana, an open-source, community-led platform featuring data about floods and water infrastructure, and aiding in emergency management. Many of the platform's data points are generated by bodies at risk, wading through inundated streets. Data, we'll see here, are visceral. So, for our final two cases, we'll think more about spatial data more capaciously, as embodied forms. After Indonesia, we'll return to two American cities, St. Louis and Atlanta, where racial dynamics have been inscribed in urban form. We study the Officer Creative Research's iterative map room, which Laurie mentioned earlier, and which partners with local organizations to provide community spaces for collaborative experimental mapping, combining the analog, the digital, and the performative. And finally, we head to the West Coast, to another city that, like Pittsburgh, has been dramatically transformed by the tech industry, including most of the corporations I mentioned earlier. We'll study the Public Knowledge Project, a collaboration between the San Francisco Public Library and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, that examines the mediated and aesthetic means by which, and the institutions with which, a rapidly evolving city can come to understand and potentially redirect its transformation. And before we begin, I usually teach at night, so a 9 a.m. call is a little difficult for me. So I'm going to stutter a bit, I imagine. And before we begin, I should note that our survey draws on research by scholars, critics, and activists interested in community mapping, civic data, participatory GIS, civic technology, and related topics. Their shared knowledge about local data has helped others steward data more knowledgeably. And their recent work builds upon an even deeper history of urban media. Cities and their citizens have long recognized and organized themselves through maps, guidebooks, plans, aerial photography, and so forth. All this is to say, place-based data is a big field, and it has a long history. Our 4 case studies, chosen in part because they are in progress projects and mostly under the radar, exemplify local data's different genealogical pathways and future trajectories. I should also say that this talk is kind of responding to assignments from 3 different institutions, so I tried to respond to what the folks here at Penn asked me to do. It's also serving people at Lewis and Clark College and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. So the case studies are in part response to all of their different interests. So 3 masters for this talk. So the first section. First stop, Pittsburgh, a city well known for its post-industrial renaissance and, more recently, the influx of a host of tech companies, Uber, Amazon, Google, and Duolingo among them, attracted by the computer science department at Carnegie Mellon, and particularly its robotics research. While these corporations are developing proprietary tools, spinning off startups, and transforming neighborhoods and the local economy, many of the city's public leaders have affirmed their commitment to publicness. Lots of municipal governments have embraced the promise of open civic data to increase transparency, enhance government efficiency, improve communities, encourage public participation in government, and foster civic innovation and economic development, or so the story goes. In comparison to firebrand cities like New York and Chicago, Pittsburgh was a pretty late mover on the open data front, local data manager Bob Gradek told me. But the 2013 mayoral election, combined with a commitment from the local foundation community, engaged universities, and a tradition of strong collaborative public institutions, all of this together primed modestly sized Pittsburgh to host a robust regional network of information resources. The principals were all there before Google came to town. A team of local data stewards insisted in an interview with me. After all, the Carnegie Libraries were born here, and the city's public and university libraries offer complementary sets of expertise in the plumbing of information stewardship and in making those resources publicly relevant and accessible. Pittsburgh is also fortunate to have the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center, which when they started following me on Twitter, I'm thinking, why is a data center, which I assume to be a room full of servers following me, but this is what their data center means. So it's a local data liaison linking local universities and nonprofits to municipal and county governments. Hosted at the University of Pittsburgh, the center has been instrumental in advancing data integration, access, literacy, and use. The center, recognizing that it's not merely enough to make local data available, consults with issue-specific user groups to determine which data sets are most relevant and likely to help citizens spur policy changes or enforcement activity. And they partner with public libraries to offer workshops on data research, visualization, storytelling, and mapping. Now, with funding from the Institute for Museum and Library Services, I'm going to call it by its mouthful of an acronym, the WPRDC, and the University and Public Libraries are teaming up with the Urban Institute's National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership, another acronym, NIP. Since 1996, NIP has been working to create data intermediaries, connecting local organizations to neighborhood data in order to develop sustainable community information systems that can inform democratic decision-making. Such intermediaries, like the WPRDC, build relationships among data publishers, users, and other members of the local data ecosystem to work together to enhance data quality, provide feedback mechanisms to publishers, and build tools that enable broader data use. In Pittsburgh, the libraries, the data centers, and the Indicators Partnership have come together to form Civic Switchboard, an assemblage of scaffolds or middleware providers who translate between different institutions, data publics, and data sets. The switchboard establishes libraries as key operators in that network, yet it also acknowledges that they shouldn't be doing everything themselves, and that's a quote from the members of the Switchboard project. The Switchboard team is developing a guide and a toolkit to help public and academic libraries work together to identify local needs and contexts around open civic data, consider roles, opportunities, practices, and governance in the civic data ecosystem, anticipate and address common challenges, and measure local civic open data health and capacity. After workshopping these materials in different locations and gathering examples of local practices, including at the recent DLF conference, which Bethany helped to organize, after doing all of these workshops, they plan to build a national network of shared practice and organizational capacity. One of the big challenges, team members told me, is simply getting potential partners to speak the same language, to bridge their disparate professional cultures. Another is ensuring sustainability, ideally by partnering with stable institutions. The Switchboard team emphasizes the importance of local context, advocating in their guidebook that aspiring participants map out their own local data ecosystems, identify potential local data partners like libraries, academic institutions, civic tech groups, and nonprofits, and assess the potential roles of each of those contributors. According to NIP's Kathy Petit, responsibly scaling or migrating the switchboard method or her own institution's indicators model requires that collaborators agree on local concerns and core values. Many communities share a concern with environmental quality, for instance. In Pittsburgh, the worry is rooted in the city's smoggy environmental quality. I read the same line. In Pittsburgh, that worry is rooted in the city's smoggy industrial past. And it persists in the fracking operations that now perforate southwestern Pennsylvania. Such shared interests inspire data partnerships and these switchboard's intermediation efforts. The Carnegie Library's Toby Greenwalt described a collaboration between the Pittsburgh-based Breathe Project, a clearinghouse of information on air quality, and the Allegheny County Health Department and Carnegie Mellon. Meanwhile, WPRDC's Liz Monk noted, many local environmental groups participate in data days at the public library. Gradick explained to me how the WPRDC built an urban greenpoint tool that merges data on land use, sustainable transportation options, brownfields, various natural features and hazards, and environmental justice hot zones in order to better inform land use decisions and ownership considerations, and to demonstrate to diverse stakeholders that greening offers myriad advantages. Organizations are incentivized to share their data, he says, when they can see its operationalization in a tool or a policy that reshapes the world they live in. So next stop is Jakarta. The local ecosystem in Jakarta, 10,000 miles away from Pittsburgh, is characterized by another sort of environmental volatility. The city is situated in a low-lying delta among 13 rivers that flow from the mountains toward the Java Sea. While Jakarta's residents have lived with seasonal flooding since the 17th century, Nishin Matani reports, unpredictable weather patterns due to climate change have disrupted traditional patterns of knowledge that previously enabled residents to predict and prepare for the flood's arrival. 100-year floods now come roughly every 5 years. What's more, an increased development draws water from aquifers, and the city is sinking 3 to 10 centimeters each year. Because much of Jakarta is below sea level and much of its developed surface is now impermeable thanks to concrete, the river's water must be pumped up and out to sea. As Thomas Holderness and Etienne Turpin explain, Jakarta is subject to a series of critical infrastructure interdependencies that bear heavily on flood management. The collapse of one infrastructure component can trigger cascading failures across urban systems. Unpredictable geological transformation, climate changes, hydrological activity, and infrastructure performance make it difficult to model risk. And there's currently very little data in Jakarta detailing the city's responses to flooding. Matani reports that emergency management services have been distributing flood information via static PDF reports to people's homes and businesses, both making it nearly impossible to communicate time-critical, up-to-date information to 31 million urbanites, and limiting capacities to gain information from residents. Without reliable real-time datasets, local and national agencies haven't been able to coordinate efforts or make evidence-based decisions, and residents have had little authoritative direction on what to do in an emergency. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip this video I would have shown, but while such infrastructures have been plagued with precarity, the city's telecommunication systems have proven relatively reliable. Mobile phone penetration is relatively high, equipping residents to serve as nodes within an otherwise impoverished emergency communications network. Enter Peta Pencana, formerly called Peta Jakarta, a partnership between the Smart Infrastructure Facility of the University of Wollongong, Australia, the Jakarta Emergency Management Agency, and Twitter, interestingly, that since 2013 has combined crowdsourced and official data streams to produce mega-city-scale visualizations of disasters, thereby improving, quote, and democratizing decision support. The platform is powered by what's so-called, and maybe unfortunately named, Cognicity and Cognitions. Anyway, it's a slightly unfortunate pun. Open source software, which draws on verified street-local social media updates and instant messages posted real-time during emergency events, and combines them with emergency data from local and government agencies. If the software detects Twitter conversations about flood or banjir, which is the local term for flood, within particular geographic areas, the platform's chatbot will send an invitation with an embedded instructional animated GIF, asking users if they would like to contribute a report to the community flood map. If she says yes, the software then sends her a unique link where she verifies her location, records flood heights, and adds photos and descriptions. The software can plug into any social media platform with an open API, and residents can submit reports to the local Clue Smart City dashboard, through the citizen journalism platform Pasang Mata, or through Telegram instant messaging service. Cognicity then gathers, sorts, verifies, and visualizes these myriad data streams, including data sets on pumps and floodgates, waterways, and hydrological infrastructure, transforming, quote, vast volumes of data into actionable information for urban publics and government agency decision makers. Developed through years of ethnographic research with partner agencies and residents, the platform, Matani says, aims to bridge critical information gaps between formalized structures of data collection and less formalized in situational epistemologies, transforming social networks into an integral component of the city's infrastructural assemblage. It's been adopted by Indonesia's National Emergency Management Agency and drawn on other global collaborators, the Urban Risk Lab at MIT, the Pacific Disaster Center at the University of Hawaii, the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap team, the Nature Conservancy, and, interestingly again, Amazon Web Services, among others. Again, strong institutional commitment could help to ensure sustainability, which is often iffy with open source projects. The platform was lauded in 2015 by the International Federation of the Red Cross and in 2016 by the U.S. Federal Communication Commission. And in 2018, it won an honorary mention at Prix Electronica, a high-profile media arts competition. So it's filling some needs in all of these different realms. Petabenchana, now run by the nonprofit foundation Yayasan Petabenchana, is being modified and expanded to address other risks beyond floods and other geographic regions. And it, like the Civic Switchboard, faces the challenges of scaling up, developing a generalizable, portable platform while remaining responsive to local dynamics. International validation and funding permit growth, but also present their own challenges, including those tied to legacies of colonialism and all these big American institutions getting involved in other parts of the world. As Etienne Turpin, co-director of the project, explained to me, the nonprofit foundation functions as a sort of intermediary, kind of like the intermediaries of Civic Switchboard, liaising between local groups, NGOs, municipal and state governments, local labs, and universities. It does all this to customize the platform's design and functionality in each of its different geographic deployments. At the same time, they also ensure that all these new developments are fed back so that the whole system is improved as changes are made in any city. He says, we are now trying to develop an institutionally agnostic network for code maintenance, so a national emergency management agency in Vietnam, an NGO in Mexico, a public utility in the US can all support each other in using and maintaining the code, even though they have diverse structures and organizational models. As of September 2018, the software served around 70 million people, and Turpin said they expect to reach around 500 million within the next 4 years. The key to sustainable, responsible growth, he said, is not technological novelty or more data, and he was really resistant to the term scaling because of all of its Silicon Valley connotations. Instead, the key is locally responsive intermediation and maintenance of a platform that, in each of its installations, serves to remind us of humanity's failure to maintain the physical world we inhabit. That takes us to our next location. Such failures manifest themselves in myriad ways. St. Louis, Missouri has suffered decades of population decline, poverty, and racial segregation. Despite local victories in civil rights and efforts at redress, Colin Gordon writes, inner city poverty has historically been misdiagnosed as a sort of community pathology, as something African Americans had done to themselves. Yet many local activists and community groups, particularly in the wake of the 2014 shooting of Michael Brown in nearby Ferguson, have developed new opportunities for public engagement and proposed action items for reform. One such forum for deliberation focused on the discursive potential of civic data. 4 years in the making, the St. Louis Map Room, a partnership between the city's Center for Creative Arts and the New York-based, now defunct, Office for Creative Research, appeared in a shuttered public school for 5 weeks in spring 2017. As I described elsewhere in the article that Lori mentioned that I published sometime last year, the Map Room brought people together to think about the geography of their city and to learn more about one another's urban patterns, city memories, spatial affinities, territorial aversions, and senses of place. The organizers stocked the room with historical maps and civic data on everything from land use to tree counts to racial diversity and population change to property values and pollution measures. Also present were map-making robots that plotted fixed cartographic objects like roads and landmarks, leaving the more interpretive, aesthetic, and connotative map activity to the human cartographers. So we'll just watch a short, plucky promotional video about the project here for a second. Okay, so you might have gotten a bit of a sense of how it works there, but what happens is visiting community groups drew on these cartographic resources using an iPad interface to project maps and data sets onto 10 by 10 foot sheets on the floor. They then incorporated their own place-based intelligences with analog art materials. Museum curators, students, activists, healthcare workers, and other visitor groups mapped multiple St. Louises. Homeless St. Louis schools, St. Louis transit, St. Louis's community gardens, life expectancies in different St. Louis neighborhoods, St. Louis tax abatements, and so forth. Subsequent visitors could then take those maps and project geo-rectified historic maps or civic data on top, exploring new correlations. Yet nearly all participants discovered that historical redlining maps, which I think we're going to talk about in one of the future panels of today, which deeply carved racialized patterns of development and resource allocation into the city's fabric, had an enduring legacy, conditioning so many other lasting spatial patterns. So regardless of what they were mapping, they saw the same kind of divisions that the redlining map kind of reinforced and reinscribed over and over again. Yet as Jer Thorpe, leader of the since disbanded Office for Creative Research, explained to me, the maps were intentionally big to allow for various physical modes of interaction. Groups of people can gather around a map to look at it from different vantage points. People can walk around the map, experiencing distance in a meaningful way. Shifts in scale and perspective embed a new spatial and social awareness. There's a material politics at play here, too. These large sheets structure collaboration and conversation, and they represent civic intelligence, a mix of official data and indigenous or local knowledge writ large. And that's kind of large in a metaphorical and material sense. They, quote, move civic data from being a resource for urban planners and academics to being an exploratory medium for everyday citizens, Thorpe said. Those maps have become part of the official archive of St. Louis, and the map room's hardware, plans, and curricula have been open sourced on a community page so that other cities and towns can repeat the experiment. At the time of this writing, which I finished about 6 weeks ago, I have to say, Thorpe said there were other active map room branches in Atlanta, Boston, Philadelphia, and Williamstown, Massachusetts, with new projects on the horizon for New Orleans, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, a Syrian refugee camp in Turkey, small towns on the Yucatan Peninsula, and Maori communities in New Zealand. Thorpe welcomes local variation. He told me how he now serves primarily, essentially has let control of the project and serves primarily as an intermediary himself, stitching these projects together by connecting members of the projects to one another. Like St. Louis, Atlanta has been shaped profoundly by racial segregation and economic inequality, both of which have long undergirded autocentric development and sprawl. Yet the Beltline, the new Beltline, a 22-mile loop of multi-use trails connecting 45 neighborhoods in Atlanta, promises to spark rejuvenation and integration, to attract new businesses and housing and public transit. Despite the international hype for the project, historically marginalized communities fear gentrification and displacement. As Mark Pendergrast writes at the start of his City on the Verge, Atlanta is on the brink of either a tremendous rebirth or inexorable decline, and the outcome hinges to a large degree on the Beltline's plan's responsible implementation. Georgia Tech's Yanni Loukissis, who wrote the All Data Are Local book I showed you earlier, has partnered with local scholars, students, and community groups and sought input from Thorpe, from the Office for Creative Research, to bring the map room to Atlanta. By making maps, he proposes, Atlantans can document and reflect upon the connections and disjunctions between civic data and lived experiences along the Beltline. And they can ask bigger questions about Atlanta's history and identity, about its rapid development as a commercial hub, and its legacy as a center for civil rights and Black culture. As in St. Louis, participants will engage in these discussions over maps, combining historical documents, civic data, and personal experiences. Here, though, those maps will be reformatted. Rather than 10 by 10, they're going to have a wide view, 4 by 16 feet, to capture what Lucas has explained to me as the geometry and dynamics of the Beltline and other urban edges and corridors. Linear maps, Lucas has told me, also echo other familiar spatial representational techniques, such as sections and transects. We deliberately set out to do something related but different from the St. Louis version, he said. In fact, we wrote our own code and built every element of our own system. This was partially due to the difficulty of reusing and adapting existing code, a pervasive problem that many overlook in their desire to believe that code is universal. Such a caveat likely pertains to Civic Switchboard and Petabenchana, too. Oops, I think I skipped ahead a little bit. So given Lucas's own research interest in local data, including the particular settings in which data sets are made and used and translated, Atlanta's mapmakers will likely engage in discussions about methods and epistemologies. Lucas proposes that talking about data in terms of their settings, including presumably the setting of the map room itself, suggests that data are part of larger social and technical systems of people, instruments, and audiences. Thus, as his collaborators make maps that generate discussion about Atlanta's local dynamics, they'll also have opportunities to reflect on the geographies and biographies of their local sources of knowledge, too. And last case study. So we now root back to where we began, amidst the corporate campuses of Facebook, Twitter, and Google in Silicon Valley. While these platforms operate on a global scale, employing workers and drawing users from around the world, they've also dramatically reshaped their hometown and region. Once an artist and activist enclave, home to the Beats and Black Panthers and LGBTQ movement, San Francisco is now, as Richard Walker describes it, one of the prime generators of new wealth on the planet, and home to many of the largest and richest corporations astride the globe. At the same time, he says, excuse me. At the same time, he says, it also reveals the perils of capitalist prosperity. It suffers from a host of persistent problems, such as wildly gyrating growth, shamefully unaffordable housing, ghastly homelessness, a plethora of low-wage work, and severe air pollution. Privatization and gentrification, driven largely by tech companies and their well-paid employees and private buses, are squeezing public efficiencies or public services. Still, other public services step up to fill in the gap. The San Francisco Public Library, one of the few free, welcoming places downtown, provides social services, outreach for the city's large homeless population. Their team of 8 health and safety associates, themselves mostly former homeless individuals, has become a national model that's been replicated in other cities. And while the local tech platforms might have expanded into global public squares, to quote Jack Dorsey, they're disrupting the local ones. In 2017, the San Francisco Public Library paired up with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art to begin examining how these technological and urban changes have transformed public culture and public institutions' places within it. The 2-year Public Knowledge Project seeks to explore the flip side of the boom. The fraying sense of community as everyday life becomes more precarious, the disappearance of an inclusive and diverse cultural ecology as nonprofit organizations and cultural spaces are priced out of neighborhoods, and the loss of cultural memory for those without the means to represent themselves. Culture and memory are the SFPL's and SFMOMA's business. Yet their ability to foster diversity and inclusion, to empower communities to shape their own civic knowledge, is delimited by the technology firms in their own backyards. These companies provide many of the tools and resources that patrons depend on to access information, but they also shape the physical, political, economic, and protocological terrains in which patrons encounter those materials. The corporate influence extends to the epistemological realm, the settings where data become information and information becomes knowledge. As the public knowledge organizers write, maybe I hope this is big enough for you to read it, the tech industry has disrupted what knowledge is, how it is produced, and how it is circulated. As information and resources are increasingly privatized and public trust is eroded, how can the forms and institutions of public knowledge be maintained? What role should the library and museum and their community partners play in knowledge's production, circulation, and maintenance? And how can these institutions, with their different service models, learn from one another in this epistemological pursuit? Public knowledge has been addressing these questions through a series of research collaborations, public programs, and art and publishing projects, which collectively adopt a pretty capacious understanding of what civic data constitutes and what public knowledge are. I should have mixed up my verbs there, singular and plural, but whatever. I think you know what I'm trying to say. The project's own public square is the Public Knowledge Library, a temporary branch of the San Francisco Public Library housed in the Museum of Modern Art. It hosts a collection of materials focusing on 2 self-reflexive themes, public libraries and San Francisco, past, present, and future. The library also serves as a venue for public dialogues, including a January 2018 panel discussion on mapping in which I was able to take part. Some of those dialogues then continue on what they call the Stacks, which is an online publication fostering connections between curators, scholars, writers, artists, and community leaders. Another such conversation took place in September 2017. The 3-day Does Art Have Users symposium explored the uses of art as a form of public knowledge, the value of socially engaged art practices, that is, and the place of art in a rapidly gentrifying city. The forum also allowed for an intermediation between the two public knowledge partner institutions, a translation between museological and library modes of operation. The organizers explained that they wanted to move beyond the archival theories that have been so popular in the art world for recent years, and instead to ask how the library model of usership might translate to the practicing and teaching of contemporary art. How might art and other cultural institutions be made more useful by thinking of themselves as visual libraries? And what is the role of information retrieval in artistic practices? This gathering thus served as a temporary switchboard, in a way like those they're organizing in Pittsburgh, where different knowledge institutions develop scaffoldings for sharing knowledge. A year later, Stephanie Sajuko's Added Value project further unpacked the library's intellectual scaffoldings. Organized in collaboration with the local Prelinger Library, which some of you might be familiar with, and Related Tactics, which is an artist collective, and was hosted in the museum. This 3-day September 2018 book sale benefited the Friends of the San Francisco Public Library. We say, what's the big deal with the book sale? They happen all the time. But this wasn't an ordinary book sale. The unorthodox display of bibliographic wares and a parallel program of events served to raise questions about books as knowledge forms and the politics of organization. They asked questions like, how do the ways in which we categorize books and information reflect invisible power structures and hidden hierarchies? The organizers asked, what would an intervention into this system look like, and how can artistic processes reshape, reorganize, and reevaluate it? Then we have Josh Kuhn's Hit Parade, which likewise experimented with organization, but in another key. He recatalogued particular historical items within the SFPL's music library. While in the 1930s, the term hit parade referred to popular tunes. Here, Kuhn uses it to identify music that, while perhaps once popular, has since fallen out of circulation and audition, but it still evokes local neighborhood histories and hints at contemporary hits or blows, like gentrification and eviction. He asks, how might music function as historical civic data? What can we know about a city's travails and painful transformations through its homegrown sounds? Other public knowledge artists further expanded the notion of what constitutes a knowledge form, or from what media we might derive meaningful civic data. In their Take Part project, Dutch duo Bick Vanderpoel deploy a 900-square-foot model of San Francisco built in the 1930s by the Works Progress Administration for use as a city planning and teaching tool, and as a tourist attraction. The model, which most likely hasn't been on display since 1941 and has been stored, because of its size, piecemeal in distributed facilities around the city, will first be cleaned and assessed by museum staff. Throughout this maintenance process, the artists have hosted public conversations with experts about the model's production, archiving, and reassembly as a process of what they call collective aesthetics. They, like Yanni Loukissis from Atlanta, reflect on the model as a form of local data, both produced and assessed in particular epistemological settings. So where you are looking at it actually matters to what meaning you derive from it and the community you're with. The title, Taking Part, signals this pedagogical mission. It references a community planning workshop process conceived in the 1970s by Lawrence and Anna Halprin, a landscape architect and dancer duo. The process promotes reflexivity about collective creativity and problem solving, and it, like the map rooms we looked at before, sets up the material and social conditions for collaborative knowledge production. In 2019, I think I'm not sure if I'm a slide behind. Let's just say this is right. In 2019, Bick Vanderpoel will work with the public knowledge room team, to deliver parts of the model to their corresponding neighborhoods' branch libraries. So the Mission District section of the map will go to the Mission District, for instance, where they'll gather local experts and community members for talks, walks, stories, and other creative activities, remembering San Francisco's past, interrogating its presence, and imagining its futures. There, too, discussions will likely address how art and other epistemological objects, like the model, can create a space for critique and speculation. And finally, in late 2019, the model will be assembled as a whole in whatever venue they've yet to determine will be big enough to host it, alongside all of its documentation and metadata and amidst public conversation. So while Take Part emphasizes the preservation of a neglected knowledge object, Minerva Cuevas' public knowledge project examines knowledge's creation and destruction. Her video, which she was commissioned to produce for this larger collective, is called Lit TV, and it examines fire as both one of the earliest forms of public knowledge, a foundation of civilization, a symbol of revolution and enlightenment, and at the same time, a cause of cultural and environmental destruction. According to curator Dina Chalabi, Cuevas explores the ways that fire has destroyed and remade cultural life in San Francisco, reminding us of the value, and I would add the vulnerability, of libraries as repositories of knowledge and spaces for reflection and community. Fire is also a multifaceted symbol for the world of Silicon Valley, with its fixation on virality and disruption, and its capacity to fuel conflagratory economic activity. Cuevas' video, I think I might be behind again. So anyway, this is what I should have been showing you, and then here we're talking about the destructive potential of fire in Silicon Valley with rapacious economic activity. So Cuevas' video, made in collaboration with local youth groups, will be available at both with SFPL branches and online. So data, like fire and the floods we encountered earlier in Jakarta, has a tendency to spread. Likewise, data, if unmanaged, has the power to wreak havoc. Artist Barik Arikan creates data models or network diagrams of power structures. In the past, he's used his Graph Commons software to map the political dynamics of internet governance, penal systems, and corporatized higher education, among other systems. He described his method in a 2014 interview. Countermapping is a way to use collective intelligence in civil interrogation of power structures. As in the map room, presenting research in the form of maps, he says, and having a social discussion around it, results in an epiphanic experience of both form and discourse. These are his words. In other words, maps give us things to think with, and they're catalysts for discussion. His Civic Data Solidarity Project for Public Knowledge aims to serve as an intermediary between different civil society organizations that are generating disparate sets of civic data about powerful institutions and individuals whose actions impact citizens. How might the normalization of these data sets and the creation of consistent metadata allow us to make civic data interoperable across civil society projects and tools, so we can track correlations between different social, political, and economic forces? Arikan has chosen two case studies: diversity in Silicon Valley and environmental racism in various Bay Area neighborhoods. And he's been organizing workshops with experts from various civil society organizations and other stakeholders to facilitate this intermediation, to serve, we might say, again, as a switchboard. For his first case, he's paired up with data reporter from the Center for Investigative Reporting, with whom he plans to host workshops involving local diversity and inclusion, human resources officers from a lot of the major tech companies, investors and journalists interested in diversity and inclusion, and other folks. For the second case, he's joined forces with artist Jin Zhu, a member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which some of you might know, as well as UC Santa Cruz sociologist Lindsay Dillon, to conduct interviews and collect data on Treasure Island, a former military base and dock for ships equipped with nuclear bombs, which is now the site of a major development project. The ethical guidelines underlying civic data solidarity resemble those informing the Civic Switchboard, Peta Benchana, Maproom, and Lucas' work. Arikan plans to encourage data collectors, publishers, users, vendors, etc. to ask such questions as: who are the subjects and makers of this data? How is it generated? And what are the politics underlying the conditions or settings, Lucas might say, of its generation? How can we link data sources possessing different degrees of fidelity or granularity? What makes a data set trustworthy? How can we incentivize stewardship to ensure data's maintenance and preservation? How can we make data discoverable and accessible? And how can we license data to aid in its attribution, to give people credit, the people who've created it? These are all generalizable concerns, but they often demand local responses, as we saw in Pittsburgh and Jakarta and St. Louis and Atlanta. Even in San Francisco, where so much of the data flowing through its servers is meant for global consumption, data and tech policy have profound local resonance. Several of the questions Ari Khan proposes are pertinent to contemporary debates about the responsibilities of Silicon Valley platforms, those same questions we examined a long time ago in the introduction. How can we protect vulnerable data subjects? How can civic data support informed public discourse and amplify the voices, if they want to be amplified, of those affected by social change? And how can social and environmental and other forms of change? How can merged data sets be used to affect political transformation, which is really what he's trying to do? I would hope that the civic data solidarity collaborations would also ask more fundamental methodological and epistemological questions about the potential limitations of network mapping and about the conclusions we can reasonably draw from the correlated data sets or homologous network forms. Just because one network looks like another doesn't mean that they're kind of demonstrating the same causes, for instance. Perhaps, to some degree, the collection of data and mapping of networks is an excuse for getting stakeholders together in a room and focusing their attention on dialogue on complex issues. It's just as much about the talk as it is about the maps themselves, as we'll probably see with the map rooms experience a little bit later today. So one of the curators of the project acknowledges that many of the participating groups would not ordinarily work together, and they lacked a common understanding about what constituted data and how it could be useful. Yet their gathering at the Museum of Modern Art, she says, played an important role in setting a tone where critical incompatibilities could be examined and engaged, yet remain unresolved. So they were comfortable with a lack of resolution ultimately. Getting near the end here. Another discussion took place in October 2018, just last month, amidst the midterm elections, when Public Knowledge joined with UC Berkeley's Center for New Media and a bunch of other schools to host a symposium. There, Ari Khan, who's behind the Civic Data Solidarity Project, alongside other technologists, examined how data can be used, for better or worse, to hack politics. The hacking of politics around the 2016 election is what put tech policy and data ethics on the radar screens of many global and local leaders who wouldn't otherwise care about such administrivia. And what many are realizing is that the solution for these global challenges doesn't reside solely in national laws or global agreements or corporate self-policing. Remediation also depends on local codes, partnerships between communities and municipalities and public institutions, policies that emphasize responsible intermediation and critical scaffoldings, practices that engender the ethical, critical use of civic data, all of which have the potential to generate and steward public knowledge and public squares, online and off, that serve their communities. So, the end. Thank you.
Thanks so much for the talk, the rich and expansive talk. I guess I'd be curious to just hear you speak a little bit more about, in your kind of methodology, your thinking, the role and figures of artistic and aesthetic practice. Yeah, I mean, it seems like fairly intuitive that there's a lot of artists also kind of working on engaging in these problems. But what attracts you to, I guess, thinking with artists and aesthetic thinkers?
Well, part of it is utilitarian. I found just in my years of teaching that often art objects are a trigger, especially when you're trying to help students think through complicated critical issues or methodologies or theoretical concepts. Art seems to make it material or kind of affective or performative. It's a really useful pedagogical lens. That said, I have currently working with the Metropolitan New York Library Council in New York, which is an organization that links together all the libraries and archives in the city. And we're working with the mayor's office on a digital privacy project. So instead of just putting together a guide to tell people who visit the local libraries how to change the settings in your Facebook, for instance, we've commissioned 9 artists and found 9 branch libraries in a geographic spread throughout the city to develop site-specific pieces that are about digital privacy. So people like Ingrid Burrington and Mimu Nawaha and other artists some of you might know. So we had a panel discussion recently, and I said something stupid, like art is a way to kind of, I said something very utilitarian that really annoyed the artists. Like art is a thing to think with. It makes these kind of critical technologies and processes kind of palpable for different members of the public who might not be inclined to read a PDF or pick up a brochure on the way out. And that really annoyed some of the artists, and I was like, okay, we'll never say that again. But the risk is sort of making art feel functional. But I do have to say there is a functionality to it, the way that I use in some of my classes, for instance. But I do think that allows for a lot of these critical or maybe seemingly wonky topics like data privacy or civic data appeal or even draw in our audiences who might not otherwise be engaged with it. It also shows that affect and aesthetics, particularly in regards to maps and data visualizations, are not divorced from the political and epistemological dimensions of working with data as well. So I think that's a really important, so it's not just a cosmetic or aesthetic choice, the way you make a map, for instance, or what mode of presentation you choose, but that's an integral part to shaping knowledge and kind of the politics of knowledge. So I think it's useful in some of those regards. Hi.
Thank you so much. This is a really
I think this is going to have to be our last question just to keep us on track.
Oh, sorry. At various moments in your wonderful talk, you've linked data to narrative and story, and I would love to ask you a question about that relationship, because once upon a time, civic knowledge was embodied in interviews, personal narratives, recordings, much more time-based forms, and now they are graphed, tabled, photographed. And so I'm just wondering if you see a profounder shift there at work, if the narrative, the personal narrative, still has a place in this system, if it has become secondary. You know, we talk about things in non-resolutionary forms and so on and so forth. So I'm just trying to figure out what the place of story, memory, and so on in this system might be, if it still has one that's important.
Well, I think it's a realization that you don't have to have one comprehensive, all-encompassing map that shows every possible. I teach a mapping class where I have the students make atlases rather than one map, and it takes a while over the course of the semester for them to realize, like, I don't have to find one map that's going to make the entire argument I want to make. I can spread that argument out over 5 maps, and not all maps have to be traditional cartography. I can include audio interviews, sound walks, other forms of mapping, kind of very liberally defined, that all have their own interesting affordances and limitations that can collectively create these stories, if you want to use that. Now, storytelling is, I'm reading applications in my program over the past few years. Everybody wants to be a storyteller. So I'm a little worried about the capaciousness of that term at the same time. But I do think that some of these projects, there are attempts by map makers, especially kind of a more feminist-oriented data visualization practitioners like Georgia Lupi, who try to incorporate narrative into her cartographic forms, but then things like the map room or some of these other projects I showed, where the map is essentially a thing to gather around that actually promotes other types of qualitative methods that could happen there. So the storytelling, if you want to use that framework, is not just happening with the map. The map is a thing for people to think with or gather around. It's a discussion point that can then allow for these other types of qualitative extraction, to use a functionalist metaphor, of stories and narratives. Okay, sure, thanks.